Remember when your dad told you to park yourself on the Chesterfield while Mom yelled at your brother for being such a hoser? There was a time in Canada when our everyday language was sprinkled with phrases that made us distinctly Canadian. These weren't just words borrowed from Britain or copied from American TV shows. They were our own little linguistic treasures, born from hockey rinks and prairie farms, department store catalogs, and CBC comedy shows. Today, we're counting down 15 forgotten Canadian sayings nobody uses anymore. Whether you heard these at the dinner table, in school hallways, or during those long winter nights huddled around the radio waiting for storm day announcements, you're about to take a trip down memory lane. From coast to coast, these phrases once defined how we talked, laughed, and lived together as Canadians. Which ones will make you say, "I remember that"? 1. Chesterfield. If you grew up in an English-Canadian household before 1990, you didn't have a couch or a sofa, you had a Chesterfield. This wasn't just any piece of furniture, it was the centerpiece of Canadian living rooms, the spot where families gathered to watch hockey night in Canada and where guests were politely invited to have a seat. The term appeared everywhere in Canadian retail culture. Flip through any Eaton's or Simpson's catalog from the 1960s through the 1980s, and you'd find entire sections dedicated to Chesterfield sets. The word carried a certain formality, a touch of that British politeness that Canadians wore like a comfortable sweater. But as American television programming increased and big-box retailers moved north with their standardized terminology, Chesterfield began to sound old-fashioned. By the 1990s, furniture stores were advertising sectional sofas and living room sets. The word didn't disappear overnight, but it quietly retreated to grandparents' houses and vintage furniture ads. 2. Hoser. Few Canadian expressions exploded onto the national scene quite like hoser. While the term existed in hockey circles long before, it became a cultural phenomenon thanks to SCTV's Bob and Doug McKenzie in the early 1980s. Suddenly, calling someone a hoser wasn't just regional slang. It was a badge of Canadian identity. In school hallways across the country, kids would playfully call each other hosers. It appeared on T-shirts, bumper stickers, and in countless conversations as Canadians embraced this goofy, self-deprecating term. The beauty of hoser was its versatility. It could be an insult, a term of endearment, or just a way to acknowledge someone's harmless foolishness. The term's decline was as swift as its rise. Comedy moves in cycles, and by the late 1980s, hoser felt tied to a specific television moment rather than authentic Canadian speech. New slang emerged, and this particular piece of manufactured Canadiana retreated to the realm of nostalgia and the occasional ironic reference. 3. Take off. Eh? Take off, eh? Rode the same wave as hoser, becoming Canada's most famous catchphrase for a brief, shining moment in the 1980s. Unlike many items on our list, this one was deliberately created for television, but it captured something real about Canadian speech patterns and found its way into genuine conversations. You'd hear it everywhere, from teenagers mimicking their favorite comedy sketch to adults using it as a playful way to tell someone to get lost. The phrase perfectly captured a certain Canadian sensibility, polite enough to be non-threatening, but clear enough to make your point. But catchphrases have short lifespans. As the cultural moment passed and new comedy emerged, take off, eh, began to sound forced rather than natural. Today, using it unironically would mark you as either very nostalgic or completely out of touch with contemporary Canadian speech. 4. Pogy. On the Pogy. Long before employment insurance became the official term, Canadians talked about being on the Pogy. This was everyday economic vocabulary, as common in kitchen table conversations as discussions about the weather or the local hockey team. The term reflected a time when unemployment benefits were a visible part of Canadian life, discussed openly in newspapers, union halls, and coffee shops. Everyone knew someone who'd been on Pogy during slow seasons or economic downturns. It wasn't stigmatized the way welfare discussions sometimes were. It was simply part of the social safety net that Canadians took for granted. When the federal government rebranded the program from unemployment insurance to employment insurance in the mid-1990s, Pogy lost its institutional anchor. The new terminology came with new official language, and gradually the old slang faded from common usage. Telling and preparing this video took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the video. 5. Skookum traveled to British Columbia before 1990, and you'd likely encounter Skookum, a word meaning strong, excellent, or reliable that came from Chinook jargon, the trade language that once bridged indigenous and settler communities along the Pacific coast. This wasn't tourist vocabulary or academic terminology. On fishing boats, logging sites, and in everyday conversation, Skookum was practical language. A Skookum rope wouldn't break. A Skookum plan would work. A Skookum person could be trusted to get the job done. The word's decline reflects broader changes in Canadian society. As urban populations grew and traditional industries mechanized, fewer people encountered the contexts where Skookum thrived. National media and standardized business language gradually pushed regional terms to the margins. 6. Biffy. Before every rural location had modern plumbing, prairie and Western Canadians had a straightforward term for the outdoor toilet, the Biffy. This wasn't euphemistic language, it was practical vocabulary for a practical necessity. You'd hear Biffy at farm sales, campgrounds, and rural schools well into the 1980s. The word carried no shame or embarrassment. It was simply the most common way to refer to a structure that was part of everyday life for millions of Canadians. As indoor plumbing became universal and portable toilets arrived with brand names like Porta Potty, the old terminology became unnecessary. Biffy retreated to historical conversations and the occasional rural context where the old ways persisted. 7. Spare a Looney for the bus? When the Looney arrived in 1987, it immediately spawned new ways of talking about money. Spare a Looney for the bus became a distinctly Canadian request, heard at bus stops, subway entrances, and school foyers across the country. The coin's nickname created uniquely Canadian money conversations. You'd drop a Looney in a tip jar or find a Looney under the couch cushions. The toonie's arrival in 1996 expanded this vocabulary even further. But the digital payment revolution changed everything. As debit machines proliferated and tap-to-pay technology arrived, coin-based requests became increasingly rare. Today's equivalent involves Interac transfers and digital payment requests, efficient, but somehow less distinctly Canadian. 8. Gisha. In Quebec's English-speaking communities, bilingual life created unique vocabulary blends. Anglo-Quebecers would often say, "I'm going to the guichet," when heading to the ATM, mixing French and English in ways that felt perfectly natural within their linguistic environment. This wasn't formal bilingualism or academic French. It was the organic language mixing that happens when two languages share the same daily spaces. Similar patterns emerged with other Quebec French terms that migrated into English conversations. As banking interfaces standardized across Canada and national chains expanded their presence, the local Quebec terminology gradually gave way to the more universal ATM, or banking machine. 9. Parkade Western Canadians, particularly in Alberta and British Columbia, had their own term for multi-story parking structures, parkade. You'd see the word in bold letters on concrete signage and hear it in everyday directions. "Meet me at the parkade behind the bay." The term reflected regional urban development patterns and local planning vocabulary. It wasn't borrowed from elsewhere, it was a Canadian innovation that described a Canadian urban reality. National retail chains and standardized wayfinding systems gradually pushed Parkade toward parking garage or simply parking. While the word hasn't disappeared entirely, it's become much less common outside specific regional contexts. 10. Storm Day. While kids across North America hoped for snow days, many Canadian students listened for a different announcement: Storm Day. This was particularly common in Atlantic Canada and rural prairie regions, where the weather's intensity mattered more than its specific type. Storm Day announcements came through AM radio, often early in the morning when parents and students anxiously awaited news. The terminology reflected local weather realities. These weren't gentle snowfalls, but serious weather events that made travel genuinely dangerous. As communication systems evolved and school districts adopted more standardized language, Storm Day gradually gave way to school closure, or the more universal Snow Day. 11. Supper. Across small-town and rural Canada, the evening meal was supper, not dinner. This wasn't just vocabulary, it was cultural timing. Supper happened after the day's work was done, often earlier than urban dinner schedules, and carried different social meanings. Church suppers, fall suppers, and community suppers were major social events. The word appeared on hand-lettered signs, in local newspaper announcements, and in the weekly rhythms of community life. As Canadian society urbanized and restaurant culture expanded, dinner became the standard evening meal terminology. Event organizers began advertising community dinners instead of suppers, marking a subtle but significant cultural shift. 12. Runners. Canadian kids didn't wear sneakers or trainers, they wore runners. This was universal Canadian vocabulary, appearing in school dress codes, store displays, and family conversations about footwear. Leave your runners at the door was standard Canadian household protocol, especially during muddy spring months and snowy winters. The term appeared in gym class instructions and back-to-school shopping lists across the country. Brand marketing and international retail terminology gradually shifted Canadian usage towards sneakers and athletic shoes. While runners persists in some regions and age groups, it's no longer the dominant Canadian term it once was. 13. Serviet. Canadian restaurants, school cafeterias, and family dinner tables featured serviettes, not napkins. This French-influenced terminology was standard across English Canada, appearing on everything from restaurant table settings to school lunch programs. The word reflected Canada's linguistic duality in practical, everyday contexts. It wasn't formal French, it was Canadian English vocabulary that happened to have French origins. As American food service chains expanded into Canada and packaging standardized around napkin, the old terminology gradually retreated. Serviette became a marker of a previous generation's way of speaking. 14. Arcade with a roll of quarters. Meet me at the arcade, bring a roll of quarters was standard teenage planning language in malls across 1980s Canada. This wasn't just about gaming, it was about the entire coin-based economy that preceded digital payments. Teenagers would break a 5 at the change machine, carefully budget their quarters across different games, and negotiate borrowing coins from friends. The language around arcade culture was intimately connected to physical currency. Debit cards, prepaid gaming cards, and eventually mobile payments eliminated the need for coin-centric planning. Modern arcade equivalents involve different vocabulary entirely: credits, cards, and digital transactions. 15. Roll up the rim. While Tim Hortons' Roll Up the Rim to Win campaign technically still exists, the phrase once carried different cultural weight. Before digital contests and app-based promotions, Roll Up the Rim was genuine participatory culture that connected Canadians across regional and class boundaries. Everyone had rim-rolling strategies, shared winning stories, and participated in this uniquely Canadian ritual. The phrase appeared in casual conversation as both literal instruction and cultural reference point. As Tim Hortons modernized its promotions and expanded internationally, Roll Up the Rim became more of a nostalgic callback than active cultural practice. The digital equivalent lacks the same tactile shared experience. If this nostalgic trip down memory lane brought back some Skookum memories, smash that like button and subscribe for more forgotten Canadian culture. Which saying did you use growing up? Drop it in the comments. We read every single one. Ring the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the brands, words, and moments that made Canada home. Thanks for watching. Or